The walls of Nineveh burn against the night sky. Smoke rises from the greatest city on earth. Inside the palace, King Sin-shar-ishkun watches his empire die. The Medes and Babylonians breach the Mashki Gate. Soldiers pour through 18 massive gates that cannot hold. This is the summer of 612 BCE. 3 months earlier, Nineveh ruled the known world. Tonight, the Neo-Assyrian Empire breathes its last breath. 60 years before this catastrophic night, another scene unfolds. The year is 669 BCE. In the palace at Nineveh, a young prince becomes king. His name is Ashurbanipal, creator of the heir of Ashur. He inherits the largest empire the world has ever seen. From the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, Assyria dominates all. From Egypt to the mountains of Anatolia, one king rules. But something is already wrong in the palace at Nineveh. Court factions plot against each other in whispered councils. A brother sits on the throne of Babylon, nursing grievances. The succession itself was tainted by conspiracy and exclusion. Old enemies watch from the borders, waiting for weakness. How did the mightiest empire on earth collapse so completely? Why did Nineveh fall in just 3 months? What conspiracies destroyed Assyria from within before enemies arrived? You will witness the palace intrigues that poisoned royal succession. You will see brothers go to war over Mesopotamia itself. You will watch as Ashurbanipal creates his legendary library. You will follow the mass deportations of millions of people. You will experience the siege that ended an empire. You will discover why the most powerful state ever known imploded. You will see recent archaeological discoveries changing our understanding. You will learn what really destroyed the Neo-Assyrian Empire. If you find this documentary useful, please like and subscribe to our channel. The conspiracy begins 38 years before Nineveh burns. The year is 673 BCE. King Esarhaddon faces an impossible choice in his palace. His eldest son, Shamash-shum-ukin, should inherit the Assyrian throne, but Esarhaddon's advisors whisper a different name each night. They speak of the younger son, educated in the scribal arts. They speak of Ashurbanipal, the scholar prince who reads omens. Shamash-shum-ukin has trained for war his entire life. Ashurbanipal has trained in libraries, learning cuneiform and mathematics. The king makes a decision that will split his empire. He grants Assyria itself to the younger Ashurbanipal. He offers Babylon, the ancient rival city, to Shamash-shum-ukin. This is not a gift, but a carefully calculated insult. Babylon ruled Mesopotamia for 1,000 years before Assyria rose. Now it becomes a subordinate throne for a disappointed heir. The arrangement creates 2 kings, but only one empire. Shamash-shum-ukin must swear loyalty to his younger brother's rule. Every decision in Babylon requires approval from Nineveh 300 miles away. Every tax collected in Babylon flows north to Ashurbanipal's treasury. The seeds of fraternal hatred take root in royal soil. Court factions immediately begin to form around each brother. Old Babylonian families see Shamash-shum-ukin as their potential liberator. Assyrian nobles see Ashurbanipal as the legitimate imperial authority. To prevent future challenges, Esarhaddon forces all vassal states to swear. They must swear allegiance to Ashurbanipal before Esarhaddon even dies. The Treaty of Zakutu, issued by the king's mother, demands absolute loyalty. Any challenge to Ashurbanipal's succession will be treated as rebellion, but treaties written on clay tablets cannot control ambitious men. In 669 BCE, Esarhaddon dies marching toward Egypt. The double succession proceeds as planned, but suspicion fills every room. Ashurbanipal takes the throne in Nineveh at 21 years old. Shamash-shum-ukin becomes king in Babylon, already feeling his chains. The younger brother immediately demonstrates his authority over the elder. Ashurbanipal appoints his own officials to watch Shamash-shum-ukin's court. He controls which Babylonian nobles can approach the Babylon throne. He dictates Babylon's foreign policy from his palace in Nineveh. Shamash-shum-ukin rules a great city, but governs nothing at all. Letters begin to pass secretly between Babylon and foreign courts. Egyptian nobles still resent their recent conquest by Assyrian armies. Elamite princes across the mountains remember generations of Assyrian aggression. Arab tribes to the south chafe under Assyrian tribute demands. All of them watch the two brothers with calculating eyes. In Nineveh, Ashurbanipal begins an ambitious building program for his capital. He renovates temples that his grandfather Sennacherib had built decades before. He commissions relief sculptures showing himself hunting lions with arrows. The reliefs portray him as a mighty warrior defending civilization. But the truth is quite different from the carved propaganda. Ashurbanipal rarely leaves his palace and never leads his armies personally. He stays in Nineveh reading omens and collecting tablets for his library. His generals conduct the wars while he studies ancient texts. This departure from tradition disturbs the old military nobility of Assyria. Assyrian kings have always led their armies into battle themselves. They have always shared the dangers faced by their common soldiers. But Ashurbanipal prefers scholarship to combat and diplomacy to warfare. His court begins to fill with scribes and scholars instead of generals. Eunuchs gain unprecedented power in his government and administration. Traditional military families find themselves pushed aside by educated bureaucrats. These eunuchs receive vast estates and tax exemptions from the king. The old aristocracy watches these changes with growing resentment and fear. Meanwhile, in Babylon, Shamash-shum-ukin cultivates relationships with the discontented. He holds secret audiences with Babylonian priests of the god Marduk. These priests remember when Babylon ruled and Assyria served. They tell the king what he wants to hear about his destiny. They speak of ancient prophecies promising Babylon's restoration to glory. Shamash-shum-ukin begins to imagine himself as that prophesied liberator. Letters arrive from Elam, offering military alliance against Assyria proper. Messages come from Arab chieftains, promising warriors for a rebellion. Even Egyptian nobles hint at support should Babylon challenge Nineveh. The king of Babylon makes no commitments yet, but refuses none. He carefully builds a network of potential allies across the empire. He waits for the right moment to act against his brother. In 652 BCE, that moment seems to arrive. Egypt has successfully broken free from Assyrian control under Psamtik-Bar. Ashurbanipal's armies are occupied in campaigns far to the east. Elam appears weak after internal succession struggles of its own. The military situation favors a bold move by any ambitious vassal. Shamash-shum-ukin makes his decision during secret midnight councils in Babylon. He sends messengers to every enemy of Assyria, from Egypt to Elam. He promises them liberation from Assyrian tyranny if they join his cause. He declares himself not merely king of Babylon, but liberator of Mesopotamia. The conspiracy is vast, involving dozens of kingdoms and tribal confederations. Chaldean tribes in southern Mesopotamia pledge warriors to his banner. Elamite kings promise armies will march from the mountains to join him. Arab confederations from the desert regions commit cavalry and camel riders. Cities across Babylonia rise in coordinated rebellion against Assyrian authority. But someone in Shamash-shum-ukin's court is not as loyal as he appears. A message reaches Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, revealing the entire conspiracy. The king in Nineveh reads his brother's betrayal written in cuneiform. The greatest civil war in Mesopotamian history is about to begin. But the conspiracy was already deeper than anyone suspected. Ashurbanipal's response to his brother's betrayal is calculated and ruthless. The year is 652 BCE. Word of the conspiracy spreads throughout the empire like wildfire burning dry grass. Every vassal king must now choose between the brothers. Ashurbanipal immediately mobilizes the Assyrian army from Nineveh. His generals receive orders to march toward Babylon without mercy or delay. But Ashurbanipal faces enemies on multiple fronts, stretching across known world. While his brother raises rebellion in the south, Elam prepares in the east. Arab coalitions mass warriors in the desert regions beyond imperial control. Egyptian forces remain independent under Psamtik I, denying Assyrian authority completely. The king in Nineveh must fight his own brother while defending all borders. Shamash-shum-ukin barricades himself inside Babylon's legendary walls with his forces. The walls of Babylon stand among the wonders of the ancient world. They rise 50 feet high and stretch 13 miles around the inner city. These walls have withstood sieges from foreign invaders for 1,000 years. Shamash-shum-ukin believes these walls will protect him from Assyrian vengeance. He underestimates both his brother's determination and his own isolation. Ashurbanipal proves to be as ruthless as any warrior king before him. He sends armies racing in all directions to crush his brother's allies. Before Shamash-shum-ukin's coalition can unite their forces, Assyrians strike everywhere. An Arab army under U-80 marches toward Babylon with 10,000 warriors. Assyrian cavalry intercepts them in the desert and destroys them completely. The survivors flee back across the sands, leaving thousands dead under sun. The Elamite king Ummanigash mobilizes his army to support the Babylonian rebellion. He marches toward the city of Der, on the border between Elam and Assyria. Assyrian forces meet him there and crush his army in a single day. Ummanigash flees back to Elam, where he is immediately deposed by rivals. The throne of Elam changes hands 3 times in the war's early months. Each new Elamite king tries to support Shamash-shum-ukin, and each one fails. Internal Elamite politics become as chaotic as the war they cannot control. Within 6 months of the rebellion's start, Shamash-shum-ukin stands nearly alone. His allies have been defeated, his supporters scattered, his coalition shattered, but he still holds Babylon itself, protected by those mighty walls. Ashurbanipal's armies surround the city in the spring of 651 BCE. The siege of Babylon begins with Assyrian forces encircling every gate. No food enters the city, and no messengers leave its walls. Shamash-shum-ukin sends desperate pleas to any ally who might still answer. He writes to Elam, begging for relief armies to break the siege. He promises Arab tribes great rewards if they attack Assyrian supply lines. He even sends secret letters to Egypt, asking for Egyptian intervention. But no help comes to Babylon as the siege tightens month by month. Ashurbanipal employs the ancient Assyrian tradition of calculated terror against rebels. His proclamations promise horrific punishment for anyone supporting his brother's treason. Relief sculptures commissioned later show his preferred methods of dealing with traitors. Captured rebels appear impaled on stakes or flayed alive before crowds. Their cities burn while populations watch their leaders tortured to death. This is psychological warfare meant to break the will of Babylon's defenders. Inside Babylon, conditions deteriorate as stored food supplies begin to dwindle. The first year of siege passes with no relief and no hope arriving. Children begin to die from hunger in the streets of ancient Babylon. The wealthy start hoarding grain, while the poor turn to desperate measures. Priests of Marduk pray daily for divine intervention to save their city. No intervention comes from gods or men to lift the siege. By 649 BCE, Babylon has endured 3 years of blockade. Starvation stalks the streets of what was once Mesopotamia's richest city. People eat leather, then tree bark, then things too horrible to record in texts. The population turns against Shamash-shum-ukin, who brought this catastrophe upon them. Riots break out near the palace as crowds demand surrender to end their suffering. The king who dreamed of liberating Babylon has destroyed it instead. The city's leaders meet in secret to discuss removing Shamash-shum-ukin from power. Some propose surrendering him to Ashurbanipal to save the population. Others suggest assassinating him and opening the gates to Assyrian forces. Before any plot can be executed, Shamash-shum-ukin makes his final decision. In the early months of 648 BCE, smoke rises from the palace. Shamash-shum-ukin has set his own palace ablaze with himself inside it. Some sources say he burned himself alive in a massive funeral pyre. Others claim he ordered his wives and treasures burned with his body. The king who tried to liberate Babylon dies in flames of his own making. Without their leader, Babylon's remaining defenders open the gates to Assyrian forces. Ashurbanipal's army enters the city after 3 years and 6 months of siege. What they find inside shocks even hardened Assyrian soldiers accustomed to war. The population has been reduced by starvation and disease to skeletal survivors. Bodies lie in streets where they fell from hunger weeks or months before. The great city of Babylon has become a tomb for tens of thousands. Ashurbanipal shows no mercy to the city that supported his brother's rebellion. He orders systematic looting of Babylon's temples and palaces without exception. Gold and silver are stripped from the temple of Marduk itself. Statues of Babylonian gods are carried away to Nineveh as spoils of war. The king replaces his dead brother with a puppet ruler named Kandalanu. This new king of Babylon rules only as Ashurbanipal's obedient vassal. The sack of Babylon in 648 BCE becomes legendary for its severity. It is the second catastrophic sack the city has endured in 30 years. The devastation fans anti-Assyrian hatred throughout all of southern Mesopotamia. But Ashurbanipal's vengeance does not end with Babylon's submission and looting. He turns his attention to Elam, the mountain kingdom that supported the rebellion. For centuries, Elam has been Assyria's most persistent and dangerous enemy. Now, Ashurbanipal decides to destroy Elam completely, once and for all. His armies march east toward the Elamite capital of Susa in 647 BCE. The Elamites cannot mount effective resistance after years of internal chaos. Assyrian forces sweep through Elam, devastating every city and settlement they encounter. They reach Susa, one of the oldest and greatest cities in the world. The city that has stood for 2,000 years falls in days. Ashurbanipal orders Susa destroyed more thoroughly than any city before it. Temples are pulled down and palaces burned to their foundations systematically. The population is deported en masse to distant parts of the Assyrian Empire. Assyrian soldiers carry away the treasures Susa accumulated over 2,000 years. Even the bones of dead Elamite kings are dug up and carried to Assyria as trophies. The destruction of Susa shocks the entire ancient Near Eastern world. No kingdom or city has ever been so thoroughly annihilated by Assyrian power. Ashurbanipal declares that Elam will never rise again to challenge Assyria. He leaves the land open and depopulated, inviting nomadic tribes to occupy ruins. But this decision will have catastrophic consequences within a single generation. Persian tribes begin migrating into the empty Elamite territories Ashurbanipal abandoned. They will rebuild the ruined cities for their own purposes and power. In 2 generations, these same Persians will help destroy Assyria itself. For now, in 647 BCE, Ashurbanipal seems invincible to his subjects. He has crushed the greatest rebellion in Mesopotamian history through brutal determination. He has defeated every enemy who challenged Assyrian supremacy over the Near East. He has destroyed Elam and subjugated Babylon and pacified the Arab tribes. His empire stretches farther than any previous state in human history. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Persia, Assyria rules all. From the mountains of Anatolia to the cataracts of the Nile, one king commands, but victory has come at a terrible cost that few yet recognize. The brutal sack of Babylon has created lasting hatred throughout southern Mesopotamia. The destruction of Elam has opened the eastern frontier to future threats. The excessive power given to eunuchs has alienated the traditional military aristocracy. Ashurbanipal's preference for scholarship over warfare has set a dangerous precedent. The provinces have seen that the king never leads his armies personally. They have noticed that warfare is delegated to generals while he studies tablets. Some whisper that Assyria's days of invincible military leadership are ending. At dawn on the day after Susa's destruction, Ashurbanipal turns homeward toward Nineveh. The procession returning to Nineveh stretches for miles across the desert. Wagons carry the treasures of Susa, including statues and gold accumulated over millennia. Thousands of Elamite prisoners march in chains toward deportation and forced resettlement. Ashurbanipal rides not at the head of his army, but behind its vanguard. The king has won his brother's war, but never led a single charge himself. The Assyrian army enters Nineveh through the Mashki Gate in triumph during summer. Citizens line the streets to celebrate the destruction of hated Elam completely. Priests offer sacrifices to Ashur, the national god of Assyrian imperial power. The captured statues of Elamite gods are placed at Ashur's feet in deliberate humiliation. Ashurbanipal commissions new relief sculptures for his palace, showing his greatest victories. The reliefs will depict him in battle, even though he witnessed none personally. They will show him crushing Elam, even though generals commanded his armies entirely. They will portray him as a warrior king like his grandfather Sennacherib before him. The propaganda must conceal the truth that Assyria's king is a scholar, not a soldier. But Ashurbanipal has one genuine passion that consumes his attention and resources. He is building something unprecedented in human history at his palace in Nineveh. He is creating the world's first universal library of all accumulated human knowledge. The library of Ashurbanipal will eventually house more than 30,000 tablets. The king personally directs agents throughout his empire to collect every written text. He sends scholars to Babylon to copy the ancient Babylonian literary works systematically. He dispatches scribes to temples throughout Mesopotamia to transcribe their sacred texts. He orders his governors to search for rare tablets in every provincial archive. Letters from the king command his officials to seek out and send me every text they can find. The library includes texts on medicine, magic, mathematics, astronomy, and literature. It contains omens, prayers, rituals, historical records, and legal documents from centuries past. Among its treasures is a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest great literary work. The library represents Ashurbanipal's true legacy far beyond any military conquest he ordered. Many tablets include a colophon stating they belong to Ashurbanipal, king of the world. The king views this collection as his greatest achievement, surpassing all his victories. For the sake of distant days, these tablets will preserve Mesopotamian civilization entire. But while Ashurbanipal builds his library and commissions sculptures, his empire begins its decay. The excessive brutality of the Babylonian and Elamite campaigns has created lasting hatreds. In Babylon, people remember the 3-year siege and the horrors of starvation forever. In the ruins of Elam, survivors tell their children tales of Assyrian atrocities. Throughout the empire, subjected peoples see that mercy is unknown to Assyrian rule. The ancient Assyrian policy of mass deportation reaches its peak under Ashurbanipal's reign. Over the past 2 centuries, approximately 4 million people have been forcibly relocated. Entire populations are uprooted from conquered territories and scattered throughout the empire. The stated goal is to create a homogeneous Assyrian identity among all subjects. People from Babylon are sent to live in Media far to the east. Elamites are scattered across Syria, Armenia, and Mesopotamia in deliberate dispersal patterns. Israelites deported decades earlier now live in the Assyrian heartland as farmers and workers. The deportees are not slaves, but neither are they truly free citizens. They work lands assigned by the king and serve the empire's economic needs. Skilled craftsmen are brought to Nineveh to build Ashurbanipal's palaces and monuments. Scholars from Babylon help catalogue the tablets in the king's growing library collection. But the deportation policy creates resentment that festers across multiple generations now. Deported peoples maintain their identities and dream of returning to ancestral homelands someday. They tell their children stories of the lands they left behind under Assyrian force. The empire has created millions of subjects who have no loyalty to Assyria itself. When the empire begins to weaken, these deported populations will not defend it. Meanwhile, external pressures begin to mount on Assyria's extended borders during this period. Egypt under Psamtik I has successfully achieved independence from Assyrian control completely. The loss of Egypt eliminates a major source of tribute and strategic territory. Psamtik rebuilds Egyptian military power and begins extending influence into Palestine and Syria. In the north, the kingdom of Urartu continues to resist Assyrian dominance despite defeats. The Cimmerians, a nomadic people from the steppes, raid Assyrian territory with increasing frequency. Scythian tribes begin appearing along the northern frontiers of the Assyrian realm. Arab tribes in the desert south launch sporadic raids against imperial caravans and settlements. Ashurbanipal sends armies on punitive expeditions against these Arabs repeatedly for years, but the campaigns achieve nothing permanent and waste Assyrian military resources on desert raids. The empire that seemed invincible after Babylon's fall is overextended and increasingly strained. The military establishment begins to notice disturbing changes in the palace administration too. Eunuchs hold more power in Ashurbanipal's court than at any time in Assyrian history. These eunuchs receive vast estates confiscated from traditional aristocratic families of the heartland. They gain tax exemptions while military families bear increasing fiscal burdens without relief. The old military nobility, which built and maintained Assyria's empire through generations of conquest, finds itself marginalized. Experienced generals are passed over for commands in favor of court favorites. Traditional aristocratic families lose influence while educated bureaucrats gain power at court. The king appoints his chief musician to name an entire year after his office. To traditional Assyrians, this seems like mockery of ancient customs and proper governance. Discontent spreads through the military and aristocratic classes of the Assyrian heartland. Nobody dares to challenge Ashurbanipal directly while he lives and rules successfully. But everyone remembers what happened when Esarhaddon divided the succession between two sons. The succession crisis and civil war are now living memory for the empire's elite. What will happen when Ashurbanipal dies and his sons compete for power? In 631 BCE, that question becomes urgent and immediate for everyone. Ashurbanipal dies of natural causes after reigning for 38 years over Assyria. His death is recorded in inscriptions, but the exact circumstances remain mysterious forever. Some later sources claim he died in 627 BCE instead. The confusion about the exact date suggests the succession was not straightforward or peaceful. His son Ashur-etil-ilani becomes king but faces immediate opposition from rival factions. The chief eunuch Sin-shumu-lishir must use force to install him against considerable resistance. An Assyrian official named Nabu-ritu-Assur attempts to seize the throne for himself. The conspiracy is crushed, but archaeological evidence shows fire damage in Nineveh from this period. Violence erupts in the capital itself as factions fight over the succession. Ashur-etil-ilani proves to be a weak ruler without his father's political skills or authority. He undertakes no military campaigns that we know of from surviving records. His palace at Nimrud is much smaller and less impressive than his predecessors. The traditional Assyrian warrior king model seems to have disappeared with Ashurbanipal's death. Meanwhile, in Babylon, something ominous occurs that passes almost unnoticed at first. A Chaldean general named Nabopolassar seizes control of Babylon in 626 BCE. He declares himself king of Babylon and independence from Assyrian imperial authority. Ashur-etil-ilani cannot organize an effective response to this act of rebellion. Nabopolassar consolidates his power over Babylon and southern Mesopotamia completely by 621 BCE. The division of Mesopotamia has returned, but this time Babylon is truly independent. The Assyrian Empire has effectively lost control over half of Mesopotamia forever. In the Assyrian heartland, the succession crisis continues to destabilize the government. Ashur-etil-ilani rules for only a few years before he is apparently overthrown. His brother, Sin-shar-ishkun, becomes king through circumstances that remain unclear in records. Some scholars believe there was another civil war between these brothers for the throne. The confusion in the historical record suggests the Assyrian government is approaching collapse. But even as recent disasters unfold, no one imagines how fast the end will come. The Medes, an Iranian people from the mountains east of Assyria, begin to organize. Their king, Cyaxares, unites the Median tribes under his rule for the first time. He recalls how Assyrian armies defeated and killed his father in battle under Ashurbanipal. He remembers how Ashurbanipal incorporated much of Media into the Assyrian provincial system. Now he sees opportunity in Assyrian weakness and internal chaos following the succession crises. In 616 BCE, Nabopolassar marches his Babylonian army north toward Assyria proper. He defeats Assyrian forces and captures several cities along the Euphrates River systematically. The Assyrians can no longer defend their southern frontier against their Babylonian rivals effectively. Sin-shar-ishkun mobilizes what forces he can and pushes Nabopolassar back temporarily in 615 BCE. But the Assyrian army is weaker than it has been in centuries of warfare. The old military aristocracy has been alienated by the policies of the last reign. Provincial governors hesitate to send their best troops to support the central government. Subject peoples show no enthusiasm for defending an empire they despise with bitter memory. Then, in late 615 BCE, Cyaxares launches his invasion of Assyria from the mountains. The Median army marches to the Tigris River and camps within striking distance of the heartland. This puts Median forces in position to coordinate actions with Nabopolassar's Babylonians directly. The Assyrians suddenly face enemies on two fronts, with no relief possible from any quarter. Sin-shar-ishkun withdraws forces from the south to defend against Cyaxares' sudden northern invasion. This relieves pressure on Nabopolassar, who can now consolidate control over southern Mesopotamia entirely. The stage is set for the final assault on the Assyrian heartland itself. In 614 BCE, the combined armies of Medes and Babylonians meet in Assyria. They march together toward Assur, the original capital and religious heart of Assyria. Assur has stood for over 2,000 years as the sacred city of the Assyrian people. It has never fallen to foreign conquest in all of recorded Mesopotamian history. The siege of Assur begins in the summer of 614 BCE under combined attack. But even as the armies closed around legendary city walls, the outcome hung uncertain and grim. The walls of Assur tremble as siege engines pound ancient stone without mercy or pause. Cyaxares commands his Median forces on the eastern side of the city's massive defenses. Nabopolassar positions his Babylonian army to block any Assyrian relief force from the west. Inside Assur, the garrison knows they defend far more than mere military position. This city, houses the Temple of Ashur, the national god of all Assyrian people. This is where Assyrian kings are crowned in ceremonies going back 1,000 years. The priests of Ashur pray desperately for divine intervention to save their sacred city. But no divine help comes to Assur, as the siege tightens day by day. The Medes bring siege towers that allow archers to fire down into the city. Babylonian sappers dig tunnels beneath the walls, trying to cause them to collapse inward. Defenders on the walls fight with the desperation of men protecting holy ground itself. Every breach in the wall is contested with hand-to-hand combat in the rubble. Bodies pile up on both sides as the siege drags through summer into early autumn. Then in late 614 BCE, part of the wall finally collapses completely. Median warriors pour through the breach like a flood breaking through a weakened dam. The sacred city of Assur falls after 2 months of desperate resistance by its defenders. What happens next shocks the entire ancient Near Eastern world and its surviving peoples. The Medes show no mercy to the city that represents Assyrian identity itself. They systematically destroy every temple in Assur, including the great temple of Ashur himself. They burn the palace where Assyrian kings lived for generations of imperial rule. They loot the treasury that holds treasures accumulated over 2,000 years of history. The population of Assur is either killed or dragged away into captivity and slavery. The city that was the heart of Assyrian civilization becomes a smoking ruin in days. News of Assur's fall spreads panic throughout the Assyrian heartland and its remaining cities. If Assur can fall, then no city in Assyria is safe from destruction. People begin fleeing from smaller cities toward Nineveh, believing only the capital can protect them. But Shamash-shum-ukin faces a desperate strategic situation with no good options remaining. His army is weakened by years of internal strife and inadequate provincial support. He cannot defend every Assyrian city simultaneously against 2 powerful enemy armies. He must concentrate his forces in Nineveh and pray the capital's walls prove impregnable. Meanwhile, 150 miles to the north, another crisis unfolds almost simultaneously. The city of Kalhu, also called Nimrud, comes under attack by combined enemy forces. Kalhu served as Assyria's capital a century earlier, before Sennacherib moved to Nineveh. The great palace of Ashurbanipal II stands there with its magnificent relief sculptures. The temple of Ninurta, god of war, towers over the city from its artificial hill. Thousands of deportees from across the empire now live in Kalhu, serving imperial needs. When the enemy armies approach, many deportees see no reason to die for Assyria. They have no loyalty to the empire that ripped them from ancestral homes. Some actually open the gates to let the attackers enter the city without a fight. The combined Median and Babylonian forces sweep through Kalhu, systematically destroying everything of value. They pull down the walls and burn the palaces with calculated thoroughness beyond mere conquest. They smash the relief sculptures that depicted Assyrian military victories over all neighbors. They ransack the temple of Ninurta, stealing its treasures and desecrating its sacred spaces. The temple is set ablaze and collapses suddenly, burying its treasures in rubble. Cedar wood imported from Lebanon for the temple's construction burns in the catastrophic fire. The intense heat causes the building to collapse inward on itself, preserving what it buries. Hundreds of artifacts and tablets are sealed under the destruction in a remarkable preservation. But at the time, Kalhu's fall seems like another nail in Assyria's coffin to contemporaries. Survivors flee toward Nineveh, carrying horror stories of the destruction they witnessed personally. Shamash-shum-ukin now controls only Nineveh and a few nearby cities in the heartland. The rest of the Assyrian Empire has either fallen or declared independence from his authority. Egypt under Psamtik. I watches the unfolding catastrophe with calculating strategic interest from the west. The pharaoh recognizes that Assyria's complete collapse would create dangerous power vacuum in Mesopotamia. If Babylon becomes too powerful, it might threaten Egyptian interests in Palestine and Syria. Psamtik makes a momentous decision that surprises everyone familiar with Assyrian-Egyptian history. He will send Egyptian forces to support Assyria against the Median-Babylonian alliance. An Egyptian army marches north toward Assyria in 616 BCE. This is the same Egypt that fought desperately against Assyrian conquest for generations. Now Egypt fights to preserve remnants of Assyrian power from total annihilation by newcomers. But the Egyptian intervention comes too late and proves too limited to change anything. The Egyptians remain west of the Euphrates and offer only token support to Assyria. Nabopolassar continues advancing northward, despite the Egyptian army's presence to his west. The Babylonians besiege more Assyrian cities and capture them one by one without Egyptian interference. In 615 BCE, the Egyptians attempt a more serious intervention at last. They cross the Euphrates and coordinate with Assyrian forces for a joint counteroffensive southward. For a brief moment, it seems this combined army might push Nabopolassar back. They recover some territory in the south and force Nabopolassar to retreat temporarily. But they cannot decisively defeat the Babylonian army or break Nabopolassar's hold on the south. More importantly, the Egyptian intervention accomplishes nothing against Cyaxares and the Medes. The Median army roams freely through eastern Assyria, devastating the countryside systematically. Villages and towns are burned, and their populations killed or scattered without mercy or hesitation. The agricultural infrastructure that supported Assyria's great cities begins to collapse under the devastation. Fields lie unharvested because farmers have fled or been killed by passing armies. Irrigation canals are destroyed or fall into disrepair without maintenance from organized authority. The food supply for Nineveh itself comes under increasing strain as provinces produce nothing. Recent scientific studies suggest that severe drought gripped the region during these very years. Mega droughts as severe as anything in the past 4,000 years afflict northern Mesopotamia. The rains fail season after season, just when Assyria needs agricultural surplus the most. Crop yields decline drastically, even in areas not directly devastated by warfare and invasion. The combination of drought, warfare, and administrative collapse creates a perfect agricultural catastrophe. Cities that once held hundreds of thousands of people now struggle to feed reduced populations. Meanwhile, 200 miles south of Nineveh, Nabopolassar consolidates absolute control over Babylonia. He spends 614 and 613 BCE strengthening his new independent kingdom. He repairs the walls of Babylon that Ashurbanipal devastated 34 years earlier in the siege. He restores the temples that Assyrian soldiers looted after Shamash-shum-ukin's suicide in flames. He presents himself as Babylon's liberator from Assyrian tyranny and Babylonian protector from invasion. The Babylonians, who suffered so terribly under Ashurbanipal's siege, rally to Nabopolassar's cause enthusiastically. Old Babylonian families, who remember when Babylon ruled Mesopotamia, support his kingship completely. The priests of Marduk bless Nabopolassar as the legitimate king chosen by the gods themselves. Babylon is rising again just as Assyria approaches its final destruction and complete collapse. But Nabopolassar knows he cannot destroy Assyria without continuing his alliance with Cyaxares and the Medes. In early 613 BCE, he marches north again with a reinforced Babylonian army. He sends messengers to Cyaxares, proposing they coordinate their final assault on Nineveh itself. The two kings meet somewhere in northern Mesopotamia to cement their alliance through diplomatic ceremony. Later sources claim that a marriage alliance sealed the deal between the two royal families. Nabopolassar's son, Nabukadurru-Usur, better known to history as Nebuchadnezzar, may have married a Median princess. The alliance between Babylon and Media is now unshakable and directed at one final goal. They will march together on Nineveh and destroy the Assyrian capital once and for all. The greatest city in the world now faces the combined might of its bitterest enemies. Sin-shar-ishkun watches from Nineveh's walls as enemy forces gather in the surrounding countryside. The king must know there is no escape and no relief will arrive from any quarter. His Egyptian allies cannot reach him through the enemy forces controlling all approaches to Nineveh. His provincial governors either cannot send help or will not risk their own forces. Nineveh stands alone against enemies who seek not just conquest but total obliteration. The city's defenses are formidable but not invincible, as some of its citizens still believe. The walls stretch for nearly 8 miles around the city in a rough quadrilateral shape. They rise 40 to 50 feet high and are thick enough to drive chariots upon. The city has 18 monumental gates, each one a masterpiece of military architecture. But those 18 gates also represent 18 potential weak points in the defensive system. No army, no matter how large, can adequately defend 18 separate gates against determined attack. The city's population has swollen far beyond its normal size, with refugees from fallen cities. Perhaps 700,000 people now crowd inside walls built for maybe half that number. Food supplies will become critical if the siege lasts more than a few months total. The city depends on supplies from the countryside that now lies under enemy control completely. Wells and the Tigris River provide water, but food must be stored within the walls. Sin-shar-ishkun orders every granary in the city inventoried, and rationing begins almost immediately. Citizens begin to understand the horrible truth that no one will rescue them from this siege. While Nineveh prepared for its last siege, another crisis unfolds far to the west. The Egyptian army attempts to march east to support Assyria, despite the hopeless situation. King Josiah of Judah, who has expanded his territory into former Assyrian provinces, blocks their path. Josiah sees the Egyptian march as a threat to his newly independent kingdom's sovereignty. He confronts the Egyptian army at Megiddo in 609 BCE, demanding they turn back. Pharaoh Necho II, Psamtik's son and successor, refuses to negotiate with the Judean king. Battle erupts at Megiddo, and Josiah is killed fighting the Egyptian army personally in combat. The Egyptians continue northward, but they arrive too late to effect anything in Assyria. The fate of Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire will be decided without Egyptian participation. In May of 612 BCE, the armies of Cyaxares and Nabopolassar meet before Nineveh. They survey the walls of the greatest city humanity has ever built in all history. They prepare siege engines, towers and rams for the assault on Assyrian imperial capital. Inside Nineveh, Sin-shar-ishkun addresses his people and prepares them for the coming siege. He promises that the walls will hold and that the gods favor Assyria still. But even as he speaks, a greater catastrophe approached that no one had imagined yet. The siege begins on an oppressively hot day in May of 612 BCE. Median forces position themselves along the eastern wall, facing toward the Tigris River. Babylonian armies deploy along the western and southern walls, controlling the plains beyond. Scythian cavalry and Cimmerian warriors join the besieging force as mercenaries and allies. The Allied army totals perhaps 100,000 soldiers surrounding the great city completely. Within hours, siege engines begin to pound Nineveh's walls with massive stone projectiles. The sound of impact echoes across the city as defenders rush to their assigned positions. Assyrian archers on the walls rain arrows down on enemy soldiers approaching with scaling ladders. The first day passes with probing attacks that test the defenses at multiple gates simultaneously. The defenders hold everywhere and inflict heavy casualties on the attacking forces below them. But Shamash-shum-ukin knows this is just the beginning of a long siege. The attackers can afford losses because they control the surrounding territory and its resources. The defenders cannot afford to lose any soldiers because no reinforcements will arrive from anywhere. Every casualty weakens Nineveh's ability to man its 8 miles of defensive walls adequately. The king orders the gates reinforced with additional timber and stone barriers behind them. He stations his most reliable troops at the most vulnerable points in the city's defenses. He organizes the civilian population to support the military with supplies and medical assistance. The first week passes with constant low-intensity combat along the entire wall perimeter daily. Median archers shoot fire arrows over the walls, trying to start conflagrations in the city. Babylonian engineers dig approach trenches that slowly bring siege engines closer to the gates. Assyrian defenders make sorties at night to destroy siege equipment and kill enemy engineers. These raids are successful at first, but become increasingly costly as the enemy adapts. The besiegers post heavier guards around their siege engines and set ambushes for Assyrian raiders. By the end of May, the defenders have lost hundreds of men in these costly night operations. Shamash-shum-ukin orders an end to the sorties to preserve his dwindling military strength. The initiative passes to the attackers who now pound the walls without effective Assyrian countermeasures. Inside the city, the first signs of strain begin to appear among the crowded population. Rationing becomes stricter as city authorities realize supplies will not last as long as hoped. The swollen population consumes food faster than anyone anticipated when planning for this siege. Prices for basic goods begin to rise as merchants hoard supplies and speculate on scarcity. The city government must impose price controls and seize hoarded goods from uncooperative merchants. Tensions rise between native Ninevites and refugees from other cities now competing for scarce resources. The June heat becomes oppressive and water from the Tigris must be rationed carefully too. Disease begins to appear in the overcrowded neighborhoods where sanitation breaks down under pressure. The first deaths from disease occur in the poorest quarters where refugees are densely packed. City officials try to maintain public order, but their authority weakens as conditions deteriorate. By mid-June, the siege has lasted 6 weeks, with no end in sight for the trapped inhabitants. The walls still hold, but sections show damage from the constant bombardment by siege engines. Cracks appear in the masonry where projectiles have struck the same spots repeatedly over weeks. Defenders work at night to repair the damage, but materials and skilled masons become scarce. The Median forces concentrate their efforts on the eastern wall near the Tigris River. This section of wall is older and perhaps weaker than the newer sections added later. Cyaxares orders his siege engines to focus their bombardment on a 300-foot section here. Day after day, massive stones slam into the same area of wall without respite or mercy. The defenders shore up the weakening section with timber and rubble, but the damage accumulates. Meanwhile, Nabopolassar's Babylonians bring a new weapon to bear on the southern gates. They construct a massive siege tower taller than Nineveh's walls that took weeks to build. The tower is covered with wetted hides to protect it from fire arrows from the defending archers. Hundreds of soldiers push the tower slowly toward the Shamash gate on the southern wall. Assyrian defenders rain arrows and burning pitch down on the tower as it approaches methodically, but the tower's protective covering deflects most of the defensive fire without catching flame. When the tower finally reaches the wall, Babylonian assault troops pour across onto the ramparts. A desperate hand-to-hand battle erupts on the southern wall as defenders fight to throw them back. For 6 hours, the battle rages on the walls, with neither side gaining decisive advantage. Finally, Assyrian reinforcements arrive and push the Babylonians back into their siege tower. But the defenders have lost 200 men in this single engagement on just one wall section. Shamash-shum-ukin realizes his forces cannot sustain such losses and hold against future assaults. July arrives with no relief in sight. and conditions inside Nineveh approaching critical stages. Food supplies are now seriously depleted after 2 months of siege and feeding swollen population. The daily ration per person is cut again to make the remaining stores last longer. Children and the elderly begin to die from malnutrition and disease, combined with summer heat. Bodies must be buried quickly to prevent epidemic diseases from spreading throughout the overcrowded city. Mass graves are dug in parks and open spaces within the city walls for the dead. Morale among both soldiers and civilians begins to crack under the unrelenting pressure and deprivation. Deserters attempt to escape over the walls at night, despite the certain death penalty if caught. Some succeed in reaching enemy lines, where they are either killed or enslaved immediately. Others are caught by Assyrian patrols and publicly executed as examples to deter other deserters. The executions do nothing to improve morale, and may actually make the situation worse inside. In mid-July, the rains come unexpectedly to northern Mesopotamia in an unusual weather event. For 3 days, torrential downpours deluge Nineveh and the surrounding plains without stopping. The Tigris River rises rapidly as rainfall in the mountains upstream swells its flow dramatically. Within days, the river overflows its banks and floods the eastern part of the city badly. The floodwaters undermine the section of eastern wall that the Medes have been battering for months. On the 4th day after the rains begin, 200 feet of wall collapse into rubble. The flood has done what the siege engines could not accomplish through weeks of bombardment. A vast gap opens in Nineveh's defenses, directly facing the Median army camps beyond it. Cyaxares sees his opportunity and orders his forces to prepare for the final assault immediately. But the flooded ground initially prevents the Medes from exploiting the breach in the walls. The defenders work frantically to build barricades in the gap using whatever materials they can find. Shamash-shum-ukin orders every able-bodied person to help build temporary defenses in the breach. For 2 days, Ninevites work around the clock knowing their lives depend on closing this gap. But they lack the materials, time and expertise to rebuild a proper fortification under pressure. On July 10th, 612 BCE, the floodwaters recede enough for an assault. Cyaxares orders the Median army to attack through the breach at dawn. Thousands of Median warriors surge through the gap in the eastern wall as the sun rises. The Assyrian defenders fight desperately, but they are exhausted and outnumbered in the narrow breach. The Medes push through and establish a foothold inside the city walls by mid-morning. Nabopolassar orders the Babylonian forces to assault the gates simultaneously from other directions. The defenders, already committed to defending the breach, cannot adequately defend the gates too. The Shamash gate falls to the Babylonians after 2 hours of combat at its entrance. Babylonian soldiers pour into the city from the south as Medes advance from the east. Shamash-shum-ukin organizes a final defense in the palace district as the city falls around him. He knows there is no escape and no surrender will be accepted by his enemies. The Assyrian Empire has terrorized its neighbors for centuries with calculated brutality and warfare. Now, those neighbors will exact their revenge on the capital of that empire without mercy. Street fighting rages throughout Nineveh as defenders make their last stands in every quarter. Civilians flee toward the palace, hoping for protection, but none exists anywhere in the doomed city. The Median and Babylonian soldiers show no distinction between combatants and civilians in their rage. Men, women, and children are cut down in the streets as the invaders sweep through Nineveh. The Temple of Ishtar, patron goddess of the city, is stormed and its priests slaughtered at altars. The library of Ashurbanipal, repository of human knowledge, is set ablaze by soldiers seeking treasure. 30,000 tablets recording 3,000 years of civilization burn or are smashed carelessly. The clay tablets that survive do so only because the fire that destroys the library bakes them hard. This accidental preservation will allow future archaeologists to recover Mesopotamian literature and learning. But in the moment, the library's destruction represents cultural catastrophe beyond any military loss. In the palace, Shamash-shum-ukin watches the smoke rising from all directions across his dying capital. He hears the screams of his people being slaughtered in the streets by triumphant enemies below. He knows his dynasty is ending and the Assyrian Empire is dying in these final terrible hours. According to later sources, he orders his treasure gathered in the palace and sets it aflame. He throws himself into the fire rather than face capture and humiliation by his victorious enemies. Other sources say he died fighting in the palace as enemy soldiers breached its final defenses. The exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain, but the result is clear and final. The last king of Assyria dies in the destruction of his capital city. The looting continues for 3 days as the victorious armies ransack every palace and temple. They carry away everything of value from the treasuries of the wealthiest city on earth. Gold and silver accumulated over centuries of Assyrian conquest fill wagons heading to Babylon. Statues of gods are dragged through the streets and carried away as trophies of victory. On August 10th, 612 BCE, the systematic destruction finally ends, with nothing left. But victory came at a price no one had imagined possible for the ancient world. As dawn breaks over Nineveh on August 11th, smoke still rises from 1,000 fires. The victorious Median and Babylonian armies begin their withdrawal from the devastated capital city. They have spent 3 days looting and killing in the streets of fallen Nineveh systematically. Now they march away carrying plunder beyond anything even their leaders imagined they would find. Wagons laden with gold and silver stretch for miles along the roads leaving the city. Thousands of captured Ninevites stumble along in chains, destined for slavery in distant lands. Nabopolassar heads south toward Babylon, with the lion's share of treasure and human captives. Cyaxares marches east toward Media, with his portion of the spoils from Assyria's capital. The two victorious kings have accomplished what seemed impossible just months before the siege. They have destroyed the greatest city in the world and ended an empire that dominated centuries. Behind them, Nineveh burns still, its population dead or scattered, its palaces reduced to ruins. But the war is not over despite Nineveh's fall and the death of its king. A surviving member of the Assyrian royal family escapes the destruction and flees west to Haran. His name is Ashurbanipal II, and he claims to be the legitimate king of Assyria now. In Haran, an ancient city on the trade routes to Anatolia, he establishes a refugee government. A few thousand Assyrian soldiers who escaped Nineveh's fall rally to his banner at Haran. Assyrian officials from western provinces join him, bringing what resources they can still command. For a brief moment, it seems the Assyrian state might survive in reduced form under Ashurbanipal, but Haran is indefensible, and its resources are inadequate to sustain a real state apparatus. The so-called King of Assyria controls perhaps 100 miles of territory at most now. He sends desperate messages to Egypt, begging for military support against the victorious coalition. Pharaoh Necho II responds by sending an Egyptian army north to support the Assyrian remnant state. The Egyptians reach Haran in late 612 BCE and establish a defensive garrison there. Egypt's motivation is clear to everyone watching these events unfold across the Near East. A strong Babylon, controlling all of Mesopotamia, threatens Egyptian interests in Syria and Palestine. Egypt needs Assyria to survive, even in reduced form, as a counterweight to Babylonian power. But Nabopolassar has no intention of allowing any Assyrian state to survive anywhere at all. In 611 BCE, he marches his Babylonian army toward Haran to finish the job. Ashurbanipal II and his Egyptian allies prepare to defend Haran against the approaching Babylonians. The city's walls are old but serviceable, and the garrison is determined to hold out. The Babylonian army arrives before Haran in the spring of 611 BCE. Nabopolassar deploys his forces around the city and begins a formal siege of the last Assyrian capital. But this siege will be nothing like the epic destruction of Nineveh the previous year. Haran is a fraction of Nineveh's size, and its defenses are far less formidable than that great city. The garrison consists of maybe 10,000 Egyptian and Assyrian soldiers total at most. The city's food supplies are inadequate for a long siege under sustained Babylonian assault. After only 2 months of siege, the situation inside Haran becomes untenable for the defenders. The Egyptian commander realizes he cannot hold the city against determined Babylonian attack much longer. In June of 611 BCE, the Egyptians and Assyrians evacuate Haran under cover of darkness. They flee westward across the Euphrates River, abandoning the last Assyrian stronghold to Babylonian forces. Nabopolassar's army enters Haran the next morning, finding it virtually empty of defending troops. The Babylonian king orders the city methodically destroyed, just as Nineveh was devastated previously. Ashurbanipal II disappears from history after this flight and is never mentioned in sources again. He probably died shortly after the evacuation of Haran, though no record of his death survives. With his disappearance, the Assyrian royal line comes to an end after ruling for centuries. The Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East for 300 years, has ceased to exist. But the Egyptians are not ready to accept Babylonian supremacy over all of Mesopotamia and Syria. Pharaoh Necho II assembles a large Egyptian army in 609 BCE for a counter-offensive. He marches north, intending to recapture Haran and re-establish an Assyrian buffer state there. The Egyptian army crosses the Euphrates and advances toward Haran in the spring of 609 BCE. They find Haran still in ruins from its Babylonian destruction 2 years earlier, with no reconstruction. The Egyptians begin to rebuild the city's defenses and establish a permanent garrison in the ruins. For several months, it appears Egypt might succeed in creating an anti-Babylonian stronghold at Haran. But Nabopolassar is old now and delegates the response to his crown prince and military commander. Nebuchadnezzar, now in his 20s, is already proving himself a brilliant military strategist and leader. He marches north with the Babylonian army to meet the Egyptian challenge at Haran directly. In 609 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar attacks the Egyptian positions at Haran and drives them out. The Egyptians retreat back across the Euphrates, having failed to re-establish any Assyrian presence there. Haran is once again in Babylonian hands and will never return to Assyrian control again. The final attempt to preserve any remnant of Assyria has ended in complete failure and defeat. But Nebuchadnezzar does not stop at reclaiming Haran from the failed Egyptian occupation attempt. He pursues the retreating Egyptian army westward across northern Syria in late 609 BCE. The two armies meet in a decisive battle at Carchemish on the Euphrates in late summer 605 BCE. This battle will determine control of Syria and Palestine for the next generation of Near Eastern history. Nebuchadnezzar commands the Babylonian forces with tactical skill that shocks his Egyptian opponents completely. He uses cavalry and chariots to outflank the Egyptian infantry formations and drives them into the river. The Egyptian army is utterly destroyed, with thousands killed and thousands more captured as prisoners. Pharaoh Necho II barely escapes with his life and flees back to Egypt with remnants of his army. Nebuchadnezzar pursues the Egyptians south through Palestine, capturing city after city from Egyptian control. He reaches the borders of Egypt itself before news arrives that his father has died in Babylon. Nabopolassar dies in August of 605 BCE, after founding the Neo-Babylonian Empire successfully. Nebuchadnezzar must rush back to Babylon to secure his succession to his father's throne immediately. He takes the fastest route across the desert and reaches Babylon in just 3 weeks' time. He is crowned King of Babylon on September 7th, 605 BCE, without any opposition. The victory at Carchemish and Nebuchadnezzar's succession marked the complete transformation of Near Eastern power. Assyria is gone, and Egypt is defeated, and Babylon is now the undisputed superpower of the region. The empire that Ashurbanipal ruled now belongs to the Babylonian king he would have considered a rebel. The palaces that Assyrian kings built for centuries lie in ruins, inhabited only by jackals now. The cities that formed the Assyrian heartland are abandoned or reduced to tiny village settlements. The deportees who served Assyria have either fled or remained in place without imperial authority. The irrigation systems that sustained Assyrian agriculture have broken down without centralized maintenance or administration. The trade routes that enriched Assyrian cities now bypass the ruins of Nineveh and Assur. The transformation is so complete that people will soon forget Assyria ever existed at all. Centuries later, Greek historians will write about Assyria as if it were legendary rather than historical. They will doubt whether such a powerful empire could have disappeared so completely and so quickly. Babylon will eventually fall to Persia in 539 BCE, ending the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Persia will fall to Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, ending the Achaemenid Empire. But none of these later empires will disappear as suddenly or as completely as Assyria did. The speed and totality of Assyria's collapse remains one of history's most puzzling mysteries still. Within a single generation, the mightiest empire on earth became a forgotten memory in ruins. Within a century, people living on the ruins of Nineveh did not know what civilization built it. The palace libraries were buried, and the relief sculptures lay hidden beneath collapsing rubble and accumulating dirt. The cuneiform script itself would eventually be forgotten, as Aramaic replaced it throughout Mesopotamia. For 2,000 years, Nineveh would remain lost beneath mounds of earth, concealing its secrets. Only in the 19th century would archaeologists rediscover the capital of the vanished Assyrian Empire. But even as the last Assyrian king died, the seeds of future discovery were already planted. The site of Nineveh lies abandoned beneath the hot sun of northern Mesopotamia. Wild animals make dens in the ruins of palaces that once housed kings of the world. The Tigris River flows past the broken walls of what was humanity's greatest city. Within a generation, farmers are planting crops on top of the buried palace of Ashurbanipal. They have no idea they walk above the remains of the world's first great library daily. The Assyrian heartland has been virtually depopulated by the catastrophic wars and their aftermath. Villages that once held thousands of people now contain only dozens of remaining inhabitants at most. Cities that were administrative centers of the empire are reduced to farming settlements or abandoned completely. The sophisticated irrigation agriculture that sustained Assyria collapses without centralized maintenance or organized labor. Fields that produced surplus grain for centuries revert to desert as canals fill with silt. The population of northern Mesopotamia may have declined by 75% in just one generation. Scholars estimate perhaps 1 million people died in the final wars and their immediate aftermath. Starvation and disease killed even more after the collapse of the agricultural and distribution systems. Survivors fled south to Babylonia, or north to Anatolia, or east toward Media and Persia. The heartland of what was the world's greatest empire became a demographic wasteland almost overnight. In Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar presides over a city reborn from Assyrian domination and destruction. He rebuilds the city on a scale even grander than before Ashurbanipal's siege devastated it. The famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the world, are built during his reign. The Ishtar Gate, with its blue glazed bricks and golden lions, becomes an architectural masterpiece. The walls of Babylon are rebuilt to unprecedented thickness and height, making the city virtually impregnable. Nebuchadnezzar brings tens of thousands of deportees to Babylon, just as the Assyrians once did. After conquering Jerusalem in 586 BCE, he deports the Jews to Babylon. The Babylonian exile becomes a defining event in Jewish history and religious tradition forever. Ironically, Nebuchadnezzar employs the same deportation policies that made the Assyrians so hated regionally. But Babylonian power lasts only 73 years after Nabopolassar founded the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquers Babylon almost without a fight. The Persian Empire that follows directly benefits from Ashurbanipal's destruction of Elam decades earlier. When Ashurbanipal devastated Elam and left it depopulated, Persian tribes moved into the empty land. They built their power base in the ruins of the Elamite kingdom that Assyria destroyed. Now those Persians rule an empire even larger than Assyria's ever was at its peak. The irony is not lost on later historians who trace these connections through time and events. Assyria destroyed the kingdom that would have prevented the rise of its ultimate successor state. In media, Cyaxares and his successors rule briefly over the territories they seized from Assyria. But the Median Empire lasts barely 60 years before falling to Cyrus of Persia too. The Medes, who helped destroy Nineveh, are absorbed into the Persian Empire they helped create. In Egypt, the defeat at Carchemish marks the end of Egyptian imperial ambitions permanently. Egypt will never again seriously compete for control of Syria and Palestine after this defeat. The pharaohs become increasingly defensive and eventually fall to Persian conquest themselves in 525 BCE. The entire geopolitical order of the ancient Near East has been permanently transformed by Assyria's fall. But what happened to the people who survived the fall of the Assyrian Empire? The Assyrians themselves did not vanish, despite their state's complete destruction and disappearance. Assyrian communities continued to exist in northern Mesopotamia under successive foreign rulers over centuries. They maintained their language and cultural identity even without political independence or a state. Christians in the region today still identify as Assyrians and speak a modern Aramaic descended from ancient Assyrian. The Assyrian Church of the East traces its roots back to these post-imperial Assyrian communities directly. Throughout history, these Assyrian communities faced persecution but never completely disappeared from history. Even today, approximately 2 to 4 million people worldwide identify themselves as ethnic Assyrians culturally. They remember their connection to an empire that fell 2,600 years ago. The deportees scattered across the empire by Assyrian kings faced uncertain fates after the collapse. Many remained in the lands where they had been resettled because they had nowhere else to go. The Jews deported by Babylon eventually returned to Judea after Persia conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But other deported groups were absorbed into local populations and lost their distinct ethnic identities. The Assyrian policy of mass deportation created lasting demographic changes throughout the entire Near East. Languages and cultures mixed in ways that would never have occurred without the forced population movements. Aramaic spread as a common language, partly because of Assyrian deportations bringing diverse peoples together. The cultural legacy of Assyrian imperialism outlived the empire itself by many centuries afterward. But the physical remains of Assyria lay buried and forgotten under desert sands for millennia. For 2,000 years, the locations of Nineveh and Assur were uncertain to scholars and travelers. The names survived in biblical and classical texts, but nobody knew where these cities actually stood. The Hebrew Bible frequently mentions Nineveh as a symbol of great but fallen power and divine judgment. The prophet Nahum wrote an entire book celebrating Nineveh's destruction as divine justice against Assyrian cruelty. The book of Jonah tells the story of a prophet sent to warn Nineveh of God's judgment. These biblical texts kept the memory of Assyria alive in Jewish and Christian tradition throughout history. Greek historians like Herodotus mentioned Assyria, but provided little accurate geographical information about its cities. Classical writers often confused Assyria with Babylonia or placed Nineveh in the wrong location entirely. By the medieval period, the exact locations of the great Assyrian cities were completely unknown. Travelers passing through northern Iraq saw mysterious mounds but did not know what lay beneath them. Local Arabs called the mound opposite Mosul Nebi Yunus, the hill of the prophet Jonah. Another large mound nearby was known as Kuyunjik, but nobody connected it to ancient Nineveh. The rediscovery of Assyria began in the 19th century with European archaeologists exploring Mesopotamia. In 1845, Austin Henry Layard began excavating the mounds near Mosul systematically. Within weeks, he discovered the ruins of Nimrud, the ancient Assyrian city of Kalhu. Massive winged bull sculptures emerged from the earth where they had lain buried for millennia. Relief sculptures depicting Assyrian military campaigns appeared in extraordinary preservation under the dirt. Uniform inscriptions covered the walls, but nobody yet could read this ancient writing system. In 1849, Layard moved his excavations to Kuyunjik and discovered the palace of Sennacherib. The following year, he uncovered parts of Ashurbanipal's palace, including the remains of the famous library. Thousands of broken clay tablets lay in the ruins of rooms destroyed when Nineveh burned. The tablets had been baked hard by the fire that destroyed the library, preserving them accidentally. Layard shipped the tablets to the British Museum, where they would eventually be deciphered and studied. The discovery of Ashurbanipal's library revolutionized understanding of ancient Mesopotamian civilization completely and permanently. In 1853, Hormuzd-Rassam, Layard's assistant, continued excavations and made spectacular new discoveries. He found the palace's throne room with its magnificent relief sculptures still in their original positions. The lion hunt reliefs depicting Ashurbanipal hunting lions became iconic images of Assyrian art worldwide. Over the following decades, archaeologists excavated more of Nineveh, Nimrud, Assur, and other Assyrian sites systematically. Each new discovery added to the growing understanding of Assyrian history, culture, and imperial administration. But the settlement would prove more fragile than anyone imagined in the ancient world. The decipherment of cuneiform in the 1850s opened Ashurbanipal's library to modern scholarship finally. Henry Rawlinson and others worked for decades to unlock the meaning of the wedge-shaped script. The first major text successfully translated was the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872. George Smith announced the discovery to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London to worldwide sensation. He had found an ancient Mesopotamian flood story paralleling the biblical account of Noah's flood. The discovery proved that biblical narratives had ancient Near Eastern precedents predating Hebrew texts. This revolutionized both biblical scholarship and understanding of ancient literary traditions across cultures. Over the following decades, more tablets from Ashurbanipal's library revealed the depth of Mesopotamian learning. Medical texts described hundreds of diseases and their treatments based on centuries of accumulated knowledge. Mathematical tablets demonstrated sophisticated understanding of geometry and algebra developed over generations. Astronomical texts recorded celestial observations made over many centuries by Babylonian and Assyrian priests. Omen texts revealed the elaborate divinatory practices that guided Assyrian royal decision-making throughout the empire. Historical texts and royal annals provided detailed accounts of Assyrian military campaigns and conquests. Letters between kings and their officials gave insights into daily administration of the vast empire. Literary texts preserved ancient Sumerian and Akkadian poetry and mythology that would otherwise be lost forever. Ashurbanipal's library contained works spanning nearly 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization when destroyed. The king had deliberately collected texts from all periods to preserve human knowledge for future generations. His colophons on many tablets state explicitly that they are for distant days to come. This remarkable vision of posterity makes Ashurbanipal more than just a conqueror in historical memory. He preserved the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia even as his empire was about to collapse. Without his library, much of what we know about ancient Mesopotamia would be lost completely. Recent archaeological work has continued to reveal new insights about Assyria and its sudden fall. In 1989, excavations at Nimrud uncovered the royal tombs of Assyrian queens beneath the palace. These tombs had escaped ancient looting and contained spectacular gold jewelry and precious artifacts. The discovery revealed the wealth and artistic sophistication of the Assyrian royal court at its height. Analysis of the skeletal remains provided information about the health and diet of the royal family. In the 21st century, new excavations at Nineveh have uncovered more of Ashurbanipal's palace complex. In 2004, archaeologists discovered part of the palace garden with its elaborate irrigation system. This may have been the inspiration for the legendary hanging gardens attributed to Babylon. Recent studies of the region's paleoclimate have revealed critical information about environmental factors in Assyria's collapse. Analysis of tree rings, lake sediments, and other climate proxies shows severe drought from 670 to 650 BCE. This mega-drought was among the worst in the past 4,000 years of Near Eastern climate history. The drought coincided exactly with the period of Assyria's civil war and subsequent rapid collapse. Agricultural production declined dramatically just when Assyria needed maximum resources to fight multiple enemies. The combination of civil war, external invasion, and environmental catastrophe created a perfect storm of destruction. Some scholars now argue the drought was a major factor in the empire's collapse alongside military factors. The failure of agriculture undermined the tax base supporting the Assyrian military machine and administration. Farmers abandoned their lands when irrigation systems broke down during the chaos of civil war. The population decline in the Assyrian heartland may have begun before the final wars, not after them. This new climate evidence has changed scholarly understanding of why Assyria collapsed so completely and quickly. The traditional explanation focused solely on military defeat by the Median Babylonian alliance at Nineveh, but military defeat alone cannot explain why the Assyrian heartland was so thoroughly depopulated afterward. Environmental collapse combined with military catastrophe created conditions from which the region never fully recovered. Northern Mesopotamia's population did not return to Assyrian-era levels until the 20th century CE. The region remained a demographic backwater for over 2,000 years after the empire's fall. This suggests the collapse was not merely political, but represented fundamental breakdown of social organization. Recent excavations at Dur-Katlimu in Syria have revealed evidence of the empire's final days there. Archaeologists found administrative tablets dating to the very last years before the collapse in 612 BCE. The tablets show the administrative system functioning normally until it suddenly stops with no transition period. One day, there are routine tax records, and the next day, nothing more is ever recorded. This abrupt cessation of records supports the view that the collapse was catastrophic rather than gradual. The empire did not decline slowly, but rather disintegrated almost instantly once Nineveh fell to enemies. Excavations at Assur have revealed the scale of destruction inflicted by Cyaxares' Median army in 614 BCE. The temple of Ashur was deliberately and systematically demolished down to its foundations by the conquerors. Archaeological evidence shows intense fire damage throughout the city from the deliberate burning after its capture. The city was never rebuilt and remained virtually abandoned for centuries after the Median destruction. This fate was repeated at virtually every major Assyrian city, from Nineveh to Nimrud to Assur. The level of destruction suggests the conquerors intended to eliminate Assyria as a civilizational entity entirely. They did not merely want to defeat Assyria, but to erase it from history and memory forever. In this aim, they almost succeeded for over 2,000 years, until archaeology rediscovered the buried cities. The question of why Assyria collapsed so fast remains debated among historians and archaeologists today. Some emphasize military factors, arguing that Assyrian overextension left the heartland vulnerable to concentrated attack. The army was dispersed across vast territories from Egypt to Elam, making rapid concentration impossible. When the Medes and Babylonians coordinated their assault, Assyria lacked the forces to defend against both. Other scholars stress internal political factors, including the succession crisis and alienation of the military aristocracy. Ashurbanipal's preferential treatment of eunuch administrators created resentment among traditional military families who had built the empire. When crisis came, the provincial governors may have deliberately withheld support from the central government. Environmental historians point to the megadrought as the critical factor undermining Assyrian power from within. Without agricultural surplus, the empire could not maintain its enormous military establishment and bureaucracy. The drought caused economic crisis that made the empire vulnerable to external attack at a critical moment. Some scholars combine all these factors into a comprehensive explanation of the collapse's speed and totality. Military defeat, internal political crisis, administrative breakdown, and environmental disaster reinforced each other catastrophically. Once the collapse began, no institution could stop the cascading failures throughout the imperial system. The interconnected nature of the empire's administration meant local collapses triggered wider systemic breakdown. Recent comparative studies of imperial collapse suggest Assyria's fate was not unique, but rather exemplary. Many empires throughout history have collapsed with surprising speed once critical thresholds were crossed. The Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization, and the Khmer Empire all experienced rapid collapse after long stability. In each case, internal weaknesses combined with external pressures to trigger cascading systemic failure. Assyria's collapse may represent the general phenomenon of complex system breakdown under stress conditions. But Assyria's collapse was exceptional in its completeness and the thoroughness of its demographic transformation. No other ancient empire disappeared so completely that its very existence became legendary and doubtful. The combination of deliberate destruction by conquerors and environmental collapse created unique conditions for total obliteration. The legacy of the Neo-Assyrian Empire extends far beyond its military conquests and brutal reputation. Assyrian administrative practices influenced all subsequent Near Eastern empires, from Babylon to Persia. The Persians adopted the Assyrian provincial system and the use of Aramaic as an imperial language. Alexander the Great and his successors continued administrative traditions ultimately derived from Assyrian models. The concept of universal empire ruling the entire known world originates with Assyrian imperial ideology. Later empires from Rome to the Islamic caliphates to modern nation-states borrowed this ideological model. The Assyrian policy of mass deportation and population transfer reappeared throughout subsequent history repeatedly. The Babylonians used it, the Persians used it, the Romans used it, and modern states have used it. The practice of deporting conquered populations to prevent rebellion becomes a standard tool of imperial administration. Assyrian military innovations, including cavalry tactics and siege warfare techniques, influenced all later Near Eastern armies. The organized professional army, supported by imperial taxation, becomes the model for subsequent empires. Assyrian art and architecture influenced artistic traditions throughout the ancient Near East for centuries afterward. The relief sculpture tradition depicting royal power and military victory continues in Persian and later art. The palace, as a combined administrative center, temple, and royal residence, becomes standard in later empires. But perhaps Ashurbanipal's greatest legacy is his library and the knowledge it preserved for posterity. Without the library of Ashurbanipal, we would know far less about ancient Mesopotamian civilization entirely. The Epic of Gilgamesh might have been lost forever without the copies made for his library. Ancient medical knowledge, astronomical observations, and mathematical techniques survived through his tablets and nowhere else. The very understanding of cuneiform writing was achieved by studying tablets from Ashurbanipal's collection first. Modern scholars can trace the development of Mesopotamian literature over 2,000 years through his library. The king who failed to save his empire succeeded in preserving the civilization that created it. This is perhaps the great irony of Ashurbanipal's reign and its aftermath in history's judgment. He is remembered not for his military victories or his empire's extent, but for his scholarship. The last great king of Assyria becomes the first great librarian in human recorded history. His vision of preserving knowledge for distant days was fulfilled beyond anything he could have imagined. Those distant days came 25 centuries later when archaeologists uncovered his buried library under the ruins. The tablets he collected now sit in museums around the world, continuing to reveal their secrets today. New texts continue to be translated and published as scholars work through the vast library collection. Each new translation adds to our understanding of the ancient world Ashurbanipal tried to preserve. In 2006, the British Museum published a major new study of Ashurbanipal's library and its contents. In 2014, a major exhibition displayed the library's treasures to millions of museum visitors. In 2019, scholars published new translations of astronomical texts from the library's collection. The library that burned in 612 BCE continues to illuminate history today. This war fundamentally altered the course of history in the ancient Near East forever. The fall of Assyria created a power vacuum that shaped subsequent events for centuries afterward. Babylon's brief period of dominance gave way to Persian imperialism within a single human lifetime. Persian domination led eventually to Greek intervention and the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander's conquests brought Greek culture to the Near East, creating the Hellenistic civilization throughout the region. Each of these transformations traces back to the power vacuum created by Assyria's sudden collapse. If Assyria had survived, the entire subsequent history of the region would have been completely different. The Jewish exile in Babylon, which shaped Judaism profoundly, would not have occurred without Assyria's fall. The rise of Persia, which allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, depended on Assyria's destruction. The course of biblical history and thus Western religious tradition was shaped by these events directly. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's rise and fall represents one of the great stories of ancient history. From humble beginnings in Assur, it grew to dominate the entire known Near Eastern world. At its height under Ashurbanipal, it seemed invincible and eternal to all who witnessed its power. Yet within a single generation after his death, the empire vanished, leaving only ruins behind. The mystery of how an empire so powerful could implode so quickly continues to fascinate historians. The combination of internal weaknesses, external threats, environmental disaster, and sheer historical contingency created the catastrophe. No single factor explains the collapse, but rather the complex interaction of multiple converging crises. The story serves as a reminder that even the mightiest empires are fragile in the face of perfect storms. Ashurbanipal's library survived to tell the story of the civilization that created and ultimately destroyed itself. The king who never led his armies into battle won immortality through his preservation of knowledge. The empire that terrorized the ancient world is remembered today for its library, its art, and its administration. This is perhaps the final irony of the Neo-Assyrian Empire's legacy in human memory and history. We have journeyed through the rise and catastrophic fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire together today. We began in the palace at Nineveh, where brothers plotted against each other for power. We witnessed the brutal civil war that devastated Babylon and destroyed Elam under Ashurbanipal's ruthless command. We saw the creation of the world's first great library, preserving human knowledge for future generations. We watched as internal weaknesses and external enemies combined with environmental disaster to destroy the empire. We experienced the siege and fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. We followed the last desperate attempts to preserve Assyrian independence under Ashurbanipal II at Haran. We saw how quickly and completely the empire vanished, leaving only ruins in the desert. We learned how 19th century archaeology rediscovered the buried cities and deciphered their ancient texts. We discovered how recent climate science has revealed the drought that contributed to the collapse. The human cost of these events defies easy comprehension even today with historical distance. Millions died in the civil wars, the sieges, and the famines that followed. Entire cities were obliterated with their populations killed or scattered across the ancient world. The Assyrian heartland was so thoroughly devastated that it took millennia to recover demographically. Yet from the ruins, Ashurbanipal's library emerged to enlighten future generations across vast time spans. The tablets that survived Nineveh's destruction have given us the Epic of Gilgamesh and countless other treasures. They have revealed the depth and sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization to the modern world completely. They have shown us that the people of 3,000 years ago were as fully human as we are. They worried about their health, they studied the stars, they wrote poetry, and they sought knowledge. The mystery of Assyria's rapid collapse reminds us that complexity does not guarantee stability in any system. The most powerful empire of its age disappeared faster than anyone thought possible at the time. Internal divisions, external threats, environmental stress, and cascading systemic failures combined catastrophically to end centuries of dominance. The lesson resonates across history to every empire and civilization that came after Assyria's fall. Historians continue to debate the exact causes and sequence of events leading to the final catastrophe. New archaeological discoveries regularly add evidence that changes our understanding of what happened and why. The story is not finished because new tablets are still being translated from Ashurbanipal's vast library. Each new translation potentially reveals information that could change how we understand the collapse and its causes. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was both terrible and magnificent in the ancient world's judgment. Its cruelty and mass deportations made it hated by subject peoples throughout the region. Its administrative sophistication and cultural achievements made it the model for subsequent empires everywhere. Its sudden collapse shocked the ancient world and continues to fascinate scholars studying complex systems today. Ashurbanipal himself remains an enigmatic figure, combining scholarship with ruthlessness in equal measure throughout his reign. He preserved civilization while waging brutal wars that devastated entire regions of the ancient Near East. He built the world's first great library while burning cities and impaling rebels on stakes. He was both the scholar king and the last effective ruler of history's first true empire. His legacy survives in museum collections around the world where his tablets continue to speak. 26 centuries after Nineveh burned, we can still read his thoughts written in cuneiform script. We can read the ancient epics he collected and the letters he received from his officials. We can see the relief sculptures he commissioned, showing him as the mighty warrior he never truly was. The past speaks to us through the fragments Ashurbanipal preserved in his library for distant days. Those distant days are now, and we are the future generations he tried to reach across time. This war fundamentally altered the course of history and created the world that followed in its wake. If you found this documentary informative and engaging, please like and subscribe to our channel, Unleash Facts. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.